Other news, a man arrested by Aransas Pass Police on aggravated robbery charges has now received his punishment. 30-year-old Jimmy Porter was found guilty by a San Pat County jury yesterday for aggravated robbery and for being a felon in possession of a firearm. He was sentenced to 30 years in prison for the robbery and an additional 20 years on the firearm charge. The robbery happened at a Sonic drive-in there in Aransas Pass.